Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good to see everyone out here today. Our lesson for today will be taken from two different passages of Scripture, one Old and one New Testament. And we'll be starting this morning by looking at a passage from Nehemiah 13. So if you'd like to turn to that book, that's where we'll get started today. I do find it a little bit troubling sometimes to talk about this topic we're going to be looking at together today of the Sabbath and of rest with American Christians in the modern era. Part of the reason for that is that I don't think that Americans know how to rest to begin with, so when you try and talk to them about biblical rest, they get it wrong. How many preachers and people of other professions do you know that retired and immediately started working again? I think Tom's a great example of that. He retired, I think, 2 or 3 times at this point. And there's the other day I was having a conversation with somebody, and I can't remember who. It might have actually been one of you all. And the fellow said, well, I had to take a couple vacation days the other day. I had to mow the lawn. I had some other work I had to do. Well, it doesn't really count as a vacation then, does it? That's just more work. You're just taking some time off one job to do another. And I say all of that not to necessarily criticize our lifestyles as Americans, but I do somewhat there, because I think especially as Christians, we have to prioritize our Christian values first above anything that our culture would teach us. But I also say that to make the point that when we're talking about the Sabbath, what we're talking about is godly rest that God Himself established in several different ways throughout Scripture. The first is the most obvious. God worked for 6 days and He took a day off at the end of it. He created the world and then He rested. He didn't do that because God needs breaks, but He did that to set an example for human beings, so when they looked at the seventh day, they would realize that there was something to that. And now Abraham came along and he continued, and then eventually his nation that came from him, as God promised, brought forth Moses. And under Moses we saw the implementation of the Sabbath, the seventh day, as a weekly holiday, a day where no work was to be performed. The significance of that is beyond just having a day for worship only and nothing else. Because if that's all it was, then the old law would not have also instructed them to have foreigners and their servants also take a break on that day. If it was just for the fact that Jewish people stop and celebrate and worship God for a day, then the rest of the world could have kept on going. But if we reflect on the Old Testament law, we see that indeed even the people who were traveling through the country were to stop and rest on that day. It was a special, sacred rest, not just for God's people, but for the land itself, anybody inside the borders. In Nehemiah, the people are coming back from exile. They've been taken away, and the walls of Jerusalem have been built again. The temple is being rebuilt as well. And during this time, Nehemiah is working to get the practices of the Jewish people restored. In verse 15, we see our part of the story begin. This is of chapter 13, if I didn't say that already. Nehemiah 13:15. In those days I saw in Judah some who were treading wine presses on the Sabbath, bringing in sacks of grain and loading them on donkeys, as well as wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of loads. And they brought them into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. So I admonished them on the day they sold food. Also the men of Tyre were living there who imported fish and all kinds of merchandise, and sold them to the sons of Judah on the Sabbath, even in Jerusalem. Then I reprimanded the nobles of Judah, and I said to them, what is this evil thing you are doing by profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers do the same, so that our God brought on us and on this city all this trouble? Yet you are adding to the wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. And it came about, just as it grew dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors should be shut, and that they should not open them until after the Sabbath. Then I stationed some of my servants at the gates, so that no load would enter on the Sabbath day. Once or twice the traders and merchants and of every kind and merchandise spent the night outside of Jerusalem. Then I warned them and said to them, "Why do you spend the night in front of the wall? If you do so again, I will use force against you." From that time on, they did not come on the Sabbath. And I commanded the Levites that they should purify themselves and come as gatekeepers to sanctify the Sabbath day. For this also remember me, O my God, and have compassion on me according to the greatness of your loving kindness. Now put your marker in that passage because we'll be looking at both of them today. Well, let's proceed directly to our passage in Mark chapter 2. We're going to look at an example where Jesus was talking about the Sabbath. In Mark chapter 2, starting in verse 23, we're going to read a little bit from Jesus' life about the Sabbath as well. Mark 2:23 says this, "And it happened that he was passing through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples began to make their way along while picking the heads of grain. The Pharisees were saying to him, 'Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?' And he said to them, 'Have you never read what David did when he was in need and he and his companions became hungry? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priest, and he also gave it to those who were with him?' Jesus said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.' He entered again into a synagogue, and a man was there whose hand was withered. And they were watching him to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. So he said to the man with the withered hand, 'Get up and come forward.' And he said to them, 'Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to kill?' But they kept silent. And after looking around at them with anger and grieved at their hardness of heart, he said to the man, 'Stretch out your hand.' And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. And the Pharisees went out and immediately began conspiring with the Herodians against him as to how they might destroy him." So we've got two eras here. We've got the time right after an exile when the people of Israel are trying to relearn what it means to be their own people and to live in their land again. And they're trying to make a livelihood for themselves, right? And so they want to sell the produce of their work. They want to make sure that their food is going to people and that they're making a profit. And so they're bringing in their food and they're selling it. And also some people from Tyre are there. Tyre, one of the ancient allies of Israel in many eras. And they're selling as well. But the law applies equally to everyone. And Nehemiah goes so far as to put guards at the gates and say, "Don't even camp outside the walls. I don't want to see you around here. Don't work on the Sabbath. We're going to observe the law." But then Jesus comes along and some of his disciples are walking through a wheat field. They pull some grain off. And the Pharisees go, "They're harvesting grain. Those are bad things to do. They're working." Taking a handful of seeds off of a fresh wheat stalk to them was the same as going along and clearing an entire field. Because what had happened was that the law had become something, the observation of which gained you status and influence and power and therefore money. So the same motivation was behind both of those guys. The guys who were bringing in stuff on the Sabbath and working on the Sabbath, forcing their servants to work on the Sabbath, forcing their slaves and those who were wage earners under them to work on the Sabbath, and thereby breaking the law. Foreigners who knew the law of the land but came in to take advantage and make money anyway, and broke the law in order to make money. Those people from Tyre, they were in the wrong because they wanted to make money. And then we have the Pharisees who want to gain power and influence and wealth for themselves so that they can maintain their position in society, live in their nice houses, and be respected by many people and be called rabbi. And in both of those cases, they have a perverse motivation for wanting to break the Sabbath or keep it. They're on two opposite sides of the problem. But it's not the keeping of the law or the breaking it that was the issue. It wasn't the bringing in the food, or it wasn't the abstaining from taking even a grain of wheat off of a stalk that ultimately became the problem. What the problem was the one who created the Sabbath also created the things that they were taking advantage of. The men who were gathering from their fields and bringing in their excess, more than they could eat, to sell it to get a profit, were taking the bounty that the Lord had blessed them with and going against his holy day to benefit themselves. And the Pharisees were taking the advantage they had, where they were well fed, well taken care of, fat and happy, and they were going after people who just wanted a little bit to eat on their way to somewhere and saying, "You're breaking the law." They were using their influence to punish and their status to lord over other people, their traditions. And Jesus makes a very important point in verse 27. The Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Does God need laws? Does God need a contract by which he has to be held? Does God need a rule so that you can tell him, you're doing the wrong thing, God? Never. We need that. We're the ones who make mistakes. So when God puts himself in charge of us and tells us how to behave, he can also tell you what exceptions there are to those rules. So if God says, eating a handful of grain or eating the consecrated bread is not a condemnable offense, a man can't come along and tell you that it is, because God has already set himself up as the one who judges what is right and wrong. And we're also talking about two completely different things. Nehemiah was having to basically be governor of the city of Jerusalem, right? He was basically having to run that city. The nobility were just wanting to make money. He had to go and scold them. He had to make sure that God's laws were being enforced by getting the Levites together and guarding the gates with a priestly guard. But Jesus is coming along and teaching people one by one the good news that God has come to save sinners. And when the people who follow him get hungry and they fill their hand with enough to fill their mouth, then suddenly people think there's a violation going on. But the difference between, once again, those two people who are in the wrong and the two people who are in the right, our Jesus and our Nehemiah in our passages here, is that the people who were following God followed the character of who God is, regardless of what everybody else was doing around them. God is God no matter what the era, no matter what laws are in place in the land, no matter who is influential, no matter who is in charge of what's going on. God is who he is, and so if we are godly, we do not conform to those around us, but rather to his image. Our character mirrors his, rather than going along with whatever we see around us. The very important part of all this is to look at the heart of our own actions. It would be very easy for us to take away from this lesson the idea that, like Nehemiah or like Jesus, we might be going around and correcting people's bad actions. We are in very few situations where that is appropriate or correct. Instead, I think the main lesson for us today is to reflect on the way God has put his law into our life and the way he has directed us to behave. We're going to think about that again with the Sabbath. The 6 days of work passed by, and God got to the seventh, and he rested. He has given you plenty of work to do. He has given you a lot, in fact, that you are responsible for. You have a duty to accomplish. But one of the things that we have to do is first examine ourselves and make sure that we are following his teachings correctly with the right character, and then go forward step by step from there. If the Sabbath was about taking a break only, and it was just a lazy day where you got to do nothing, there wouldn't have been worship services attached to it. It would have just been another day. And if the Sabbath was just worship, then it wouldn't have mattered if you worked, because you could just go to church and then go home and work, like a lot of us will today. Because we've got stuff we need to do. That's just how we manage our time. But it was both. The rest was a sacred act. And so when the people undertook it, they were thinking not only of what their actions were, but who it was that asked them to do it. So when Jesus went to the synagogue and he told the man who had the crippled hand to stretch his hand out, and the man was healed, he didn't just perform miracles just to be nice. I will say this definition of miracle that I've shared with you before. I'll say it again. A miracle is divine intervention for the proof of godly authority on the one who is taking that action. Jesus was showing God is on my side. So that grain that was taken by my followers, God approves of that. This man who's being healed, doing good on the Sabbath, God approves of doing good rather than doing evil. That was the stamp of God's approval on Jesus' teaching. That was the purpose for that. So here is our lesson for today. Whether we're resting, whether we're working. As a preacher with a day job, I have 6 days of work, so I know all about working, believe me. We have a character that reflects who it is we work for. And whether we are doing what he asks us to do and taking a moment for ourselves and recharging and reflecting on all the things he's given us and having our Sabbath moment of gratitude to him for all of our blessings, as well as rest and peace in our hearts in his presence, or whether we are doing the work he wants us to do with our hands for him in our everyday lives, we still are bringing our hearts and our minds back to him continually. We are practicing a lifestyle that reflects who God is in any position of our lives at any time. And that's the only way that people will know who God is if they see his people acting like him. There's a lot to be said for the ability of a person to interpret the scriptures, to open up the Bible and to figure out for themselves exactly who it is that God is. But that really doesn't drive home the point of who God is as much as seeing his impact in the lives of people around you. That's why we have church, right? We're to get together, support one another, do good for one another, and to make sure that our community is centered around Christ. And the same goes for the gospel. If we are not reflecting God's character, it doesn't matter how well we're keeping his commandments. I hope that this lesson has been beneficial for you today. And if you haven't been subject to God's commands to be baptized, we have an opportunity that we can give to you, that you could be baptized at this time. And if there's any other anything else we can do for you, whether that be prayers for the church for your restoration or your comfort, we ask that you come forward now as we stand and sing.